Okay, so in this section we're looking at research questions, and we're looking at how research questions are developed. And we've gone down through the chapter and we've looked at the various steps that you need to take. So for example, you might have a general area of interest, then you might identify the research question within that general area of interest. Then you might go on and look at objectives and try and identify objectives in that particular area. And as part of that, you might develop maybe a hypothesis or hypotheses that you want to have examine or even test. Okay. Now, the hypothesis can help the researcher to refine the statement of objectives so that there's a clear idea of the levels of measurements and types of variables you can later apply in the methodology. And that's important to note. I mean, when you're thinking about the research area, you're thinking about your research objectives, and of course developing your hypothesis or hypotheses, it is important to remember that later on you may need to apply some kind of analysis or empirical method to the data that you've collected. So for example, you might be interested in the area of obesity, quite a topical issue at the moment. And you might also be interested in identifying a question in that particular area, like it might be how expenditure affects food consumption, or how much households spend on food. And then you might divide up food into healthier and unhealthy foods, whatever the case may be. But with these kind of general statements or hypothesis in this case, like how much households spend on food, you might go on then and decide to have a number of objectives. Like you might be interested in finding out, well, do males spend more on healthy foods? Or you might be interested in finding out age and whether younger people are more likely to spend on unhealthy foods and older individuals are more likely to spend on healthy foods. And I suppose that leads me nicely into this section, in a sense that when you're thinking about your objectives, and this will obviously help you develop your questions that you're going to include in your questionnaire, but the types of questions that you have in your questionnaire is something to keep in mind always. So for example, if you have that question there, males spend more on unhealthy foods, as one of your objectives, then you might think about putting in a question in your questionnaire on gender, where you have gender, males, females. Actually, it should be male, that should be female. Where you might have state your gender, in your questionnaire, and then you get the individual to tick either male or female. Now with this type of question, you have to think about, well, okay, how am I going to generate results from this type of question? So in this case, would be an example of a nominal type data. And afterwards, you could think about maybe producing descriptive statistics like a frequency distribution using this type of data. Now, the reason I suppose I'm emphasizing this is you've gone and you've done the hard bit, in a sense that you've identified a research question, you've identified research objectives, and now you're trying to construct your questionnaire in that particular area. And within that questionnaire, you're going to have a number of questions. And as I say, we're just taking the example of how much households spend on food. You might be interested in what males and how much they spend maybe on unhealthy foods. And one of the questions that you have inside there is gender. As I say, this is nominal type data, where later on the individual will tick the box, either male or female, and then you assign them to a category. And you might decide to have males as category 1 and females as category 2, which are mutually exclusive. You then might go on and do a type of analysis on that data, and this is the important bit. You have to be aware of the type of methodology that you can later apply to your data. So for example, coming back up here again, I mean, that was just one example of nominal data. If you have how much households spend on food, you're looking at expenditure and maybe food consumption. And what you might be interested in finding out later on is applying some kind of empirical method, like a regression analysis on this type of data, where you identify maybe a dependent variable and a number of independent variables. And again, with this type of question where you have maybe the factors that affect food consumption or how expenditure affects food consumption, you might think about obviously putting in socioeconomic variables such as age, gender, income, so demographics as well as socioeconomic variables, um, and thinking about how they affect your dependent variable, and again thinking about the type of methodology that you can use. Now we'll be exploring that more in section 2 of this course outline, but it's just something that we want you to be aware of very early on, because as I say, when you're identifying the questions that you need to include in your questionnaire, it's important to also think about the type of analysis that you can later do and can produce results on.